Police officer hits royal guard. The guard's reaction was unexpected. It was a bright, cool morning in London. The sun had risen behind the tall buildings, casting a golden light on the streets of the city. Outside Buckingham Palace, the usual buzz of excitement filled the air. People from all over the world had gathered at the black and gold gates, holding up their phones and cameras, eager to catch a glimpse of the famous Queen's Guard. Tour buses lined up along the streets. Children clung to their parents, trying to peek through the crowds. Some tourists had been waiting since early morning just to see the changing of the guard, a tradition that had lasted for hundreds of years. Everyone knew about the guards in red coats and tall black hats. They were famous for standing still, never speaking, never smiling, no matter what happened around them. Among the people working there that day was police officer Michael Reed. He was in his mid-30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp blue eyes and a voice that carried over the crowd. Officer Reed had been part of the London police force for more than a decade. He liked his job and took pride in keeping people safe. But he also had a reputation for being a bit impatient. While he was not rude, he sometimes got annoyed quickly when things didn't go smoothly. As usual, his job that day was crowd control. With so many visitors near the palace, the police had to make sure that no one got too close to the guards or caused trouble. Officer Reed walked slowly along the front of the gate, reminding tourists not to cross the lines marked on the ground. He held a whistle and a short wooden baton, not to use just as part of his uniform, and wore a black cap with the silver police badge shining in the morning light. The first hour passed calmly. The crowd took photos, children giggled, and street performers played music in the distance. The guards stood motionless, facing straight ahead. They didn't blink much. They didn't respond to people calling out to them. That's what made them so interesting to watch. It was almost like watching statues that could breathe. But by late morning, the area had grown much busier. The narrow sidewalks were now packed shoulder to shoulder. More tourists had arrived, some pushing forward for a better view. Parents lifted their children onto their shoulders. Selfie sticks popped up everywhere. There were voices in different languages, laughter, and sometimes shouting. In the middle of this, Officer Reed started to feel the pressure. A group of teenagers was trying to lean over the barriers. An elderly man asked him loudly if the guards ever smiled. A couple insisted they had seen videos online of people making the guards laugh and wanted to try it themselves. "No, sir, they don't react," Reed said firmly, his hands behind his back. "Please step away from the rope." But the couple didn't listen. They walked even closer, one of them pretending to march like a guard. The crowd laughed. Phones were recording. Reed gave a sharp whistle and moved toward them. "Step back now," he said, louder this time. His voice had a strict edge, and the couple slowly backed away, still giggling. It wasn't unusual for tourists to test the limits. Many people thought the guards were just actors or that their silence was part of a show. But Officer Reed knew better. These men were trained soldiers. Some had been in the military for years. Their job wasn't to entertain, it was to serve and protect a place of deep historical and national value. Still, the laughter and jokes continued. Just before noon, something unusual happened. A young man in a hoodie pushed his way to the front. He had a small camera and looked like he was filming for a social media video. He started making loud jokes about the guards, stepping forward and back like he was mocking their stance. At first, people laughed. But then he stepped too close, his foot landing inside the restricted area. Officer Reed reacted quickly. He marched forward, holding out his hand. "You, step out of the line, now." The young man looked up and smiled as if it was part of a joke, but Reed wasn't amused. He didn't like being ignored. The man slowly stepped back but didn't apologize. Instead, he kept filming, pointing the camera at Reed now. "You think it's funny?" the officer asked, narrowing his eyes. "This isn't a playground." The man didn't answer. He simply walked away into the crowd. Reed let out a long breath. His jaw tightened. He could feel the heat rising to his face. It wasn't just about the prank, it was the lack of respect. For the guards, for the police, for the entire setting. As the day continued, things didn't calm down. A child dropped a bottle over the barrier, and the parents begged Reed to let them retrieve it. Another group of tourists started chanting in a way that felt disrespectful. Reed's patience was wearing thin. He looked over at one of the royal guards standing close to the palace gate. The guard was tall, wearing the signature red coat, black boots, and bearskin hat. His face was still, his eyes staring straight ahead. Tourists snapped photos just a few feet from his face, and he didn't move an inch. Reed had always admired the guards. How could they stay so calm when people were constantly invading their space, trying to make them break character? Sometimes Reed wished he could do the same, just block out the noise, the chaos, the endless questions. But he couldn't. That wasn't his job. His job was to speak, to stop people, to deal with behavior that got out of hand. As the clock ticked closer to noon, the biggest crowd of the day gathered. It was time for the changing of the guard. The ceremonial event brought even more excitement. Drums echoed from the street as the new guards began marching in perfect step. Cameras flashed and people leaned forward to get better views. Reed moved along the front, urging people to stay back. "Please stay behind the line," he said for the 100th time. "Move back, madam, thank you." Then it happened. In the middle of all the movement, a tourist accidentally dropped her bag onto the path where the guards were about to walk. She gasped and leaned forward to grab it, stepping directly into the guards' area. Reed acted fast. He reached out to stop her and grabbed the strap of the bag, pulling it away from the ground. But in the confusion, as he turned back, he bumped the shoulder of the guard nearest to him. The contact wasn't hard, but it was real, enough to be noticed. The crowd froze. It was like time stopped for a moment. People turned their heads. The guard didn't move, not at first. His eyes didn't shift. His hands stayed on his rifle. But everyone had seen it, a police officer touching a royal guard. Reed didn't realize right away what had happened. He was still handing the bag back to the woman who was thanking him, but whispers had already begun spreading through the crowd. Cameras had captured it. People murmured. Did he just touch the guard? Was it an accident? What will the guard do? Reed turned slowly and saw the guard now looking directly at him. A small turn of the head, but enough to break the stillness. Enough to let everyone know that he had noticed. And then something truly unexpected happened. The guard, whose face had shown no emotion all day, parted his lips slightly and spoke. But that quiet, powerful reaction would become a story of its own. A story that would travel far beyond the gates of Buckingham Palace. Because what happened next wasn't about anger or punishment. It was about dignity, and no one in that crowd would forget it. The crowd outside Buckingham Palace had gone strangely quiet. The happy noise that had filled the air just moments before had faded. People who had been laughing and talking now stood with wide eyes and frozen hands, many holding up their phones without pressing record. It wasn't just the usual surprise that came when something unusual happened. It was the kind of silence that came when people weren't sure what they had just seen, but they knew it was important. Police officer Michael Reed stood just a step away from one of the Queen's royal guards. He was still holding the strap of a tourist's handbag, but his focus had shifted. His eyes were now locked with the guard. A strange kind of electricity filled the space between them. For a moment, it was hard to tell what had actually happened. Some thought Officer Reed had hit the guard. Others believed it was just an accidental bump during the rush to grab the woman's bag. But the truth was somewhere in the middle. The guard had been touched, not with force, not with anger, but with a sudden movement that came out of tension and stress. It wasn't meant to be harmful, but it broke an unwritten rule. You don't touch the royal guards. It's a rule that isn't written on signs or posted on fences, but everyone seems to know it. The guards, with their red coats and tall black hats, are more than soldiers. They're symbols of tradition, discipline, and national pride. They don't speak. They don't move. They don't react until now. Reed took a step back. He could feel the air around him change. His heart beat a little faster. He hadn't meant to touch the guard, but he had, and now he didn't know what would happen next. The guard turned his head not much, just enough that Reed and everyone else could see it. That slight movement broke the perfect stillness the guard had held all morning, and then something even more surprising happened. The guard spoke. His voice was calm and even. Not loud, not angry, just steady. "Sir," he said, looking straight at Officer Reed, "this is not how we do things here." That was all, just one sentence, but it echoed like thunder. The crowd gasped. Some looked at each other with wide eyes. Others raised their phones again, recording every second. No one could believe it. A royal guard speaking, breaking protocol in public in front of hundreds of people. Officer Reed blinked. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out right away. His mind was racing. He had worked many shifts around the palace, had seen the guards day after day, and had always admired their discipline. Now he had somehow caused one of them to speak, to break the silence that was their badge of honor. He took another step back and lowered his head slightly. "My apologies," he said quietly, just loud enough for the guard to hear. The guard gave a short nod, then turned his head forward again and returned to his position, still straight silent. The crowd remained quiet for a few seconds longer, then the sound of whispers began to rise. Tourists looked at each other, some asking if anyone had caught the moment on video. Others stared at Officer Reed, who now seemed to be the center of attention. He walked slowly away from the guard, back toward the edge of the crowd where another officer was standing. It was Officer Patel, his partner for the day, a kind and soft-spoken man who had seen the whole thing. "Mike," Patel said softly, "you okay?" Reed didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, then back at the guard. "He spoke," he said almost to himself. "Did you hear it? He actually spoke." Patel nodded. "Everyone heard it," Reed let out a breath. "I didn't mean to bump him. I was just trying to keep the woman from stepping in." "I know," Patel said, "but you did touch him." Reed looked around. People were still watching. Some were pointing. A few were already uploading their videos to social media. The incident wasn't going to stay quiet for long. He felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. Not because he had done something awful, but because he had done something careless in a place where everything mattered. The rest of the day passed slowly. Reed continued to do his duty, but something inside him had changed. He wasn't angry, but he was shaken. The guard's words had stayed in his mind, repeating over and over, "This is not how we do things here." It wasn't just a correction. It was a reminder that there was a way to act, a way to carry oneself, especially in a place like this. The palace, the guards, the tradition, it all stood for something bigger than any one person. And Reed had stepped outside those lines, even if just for a second. By evening, word of the event had already started to spread. A short video had gone viral online with the title, "Police Officer Touches Royal Guard, Guard Responds with Unexpected Words." Comments flooded in. Some people criticized Reed, calling him disrespectful. Others defended him, saying it was clearly a mistake. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing: the guard's response had been powerful. People wrote messages like, "He didn't yell, he didn't react with anger, he just reminded the officer with calm strength what the guard stands for. A true professional. That guard deserves a medal. Sometimes quiet words are louder than shouting." Inside the palace, the royal guard who had spoken was taken back inside after the ceremony ended. His fellow guards looked at him with quiet respect. No one teased him, no one scolded him. They all understood that something unusual had happened, and that he had handled it with dignity. Later that evening, in a private room within the palace grounds, he was quietly visited by his commanding officer. "You showed restraint," the officer said, "and you maintained the spirit of the role. Well done." The guard nodded but said nothing more. He didn't need to. He knew he had broken the silence only when it mattered most, and in a way that honored his position. Meanwhile, Officer Reed sat at home, watching the video again on his phone. He saw himself moving, saw the moment the guard turned his head. He watched the reaction of the crowd, the nod, the silence that followed, over and over again. He felt embarrassed but not ashamed. He hadn't meant harm, but he had learned something important. His wife sat beside him, watching the video too. "He handled it well," she said. "Yes," Reed replied softly. "Better than I did." He thought about the words again. "This is not how we do things here." They stayed with him, not as a punishment, but as a lesson. The next day, when he returned to duty, Reed stood a little taller. He spoke a little softer. He moved with more care. He looked at the guards with even more respect than before. Something had changed in him, and something had changed in the people who had seen what happened. Because sometimes it's not the loudest voice that teaches the most. Sometimes it's the one that stays quiet until just the right moment, and speaks with calm strength when it truly matters. The city was still waking up when the video began to spread across the internet. What had started as just another day at Buckingham Palace had now become something talked about across the country, and even beyond. News stations picked it up, social media platforms were flooded with the clip, and people everywhere were sharing their opinions. The short video showed a single moment: a police officer brushing against a royal guard during a busy crowd situation, and the guard breaking his usual silence to calmly say, "Sir, this is not how we do things here." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud, but it was powerful. People were surprised, impressed, and even moved by the guard's composed reaction. By the afternoon, it had become one of the most viewed videos of the week. Some viewers saw it as a rare look behind the seriousness of the guard's duty. Others admired how respectful and steady the guard had remained. And for many, it was Officer Reed's reaction that made the story even more human. The way he stepped back, apologized, and clearly took the moment to heart. It wasn't a story about mistakes or blame. It had become a story about discipline, humility, and mutual respect. At the police station where Officer Reed worked, things were changing quickly. Reed had already spoken to his supervisor, who was understanding but firm. They both knew that even though the contact with the guard was aggressive or intentional, it had happened during duty hours and in a high-profile location. With cameras everywhere, anything could turn into a public event, and that's exactly what had happened. "Mike," his supervisor said, "you know I believe you, I've seen the footage, but this is being taken seriously. We'll need to file a report. There might be a formal review." Reed nodded slowly. "I understand." "You're not in trouble," the supervisor added. "But the department has to respond. People are watching." And people were watching. As comments and reactions grew online, a group of local journalists reached out to the police department, asking for an official statement. The department replied with calm and professional words, saying they were looking into the matter, that no harm had occurred, and that all officers were reminded of the importance of respecting the duties and space of ceremonial staff. Reed wasn't asked to take leave, but he was asked to take a break from the palace assignment for a few days. Instead, he was moved to another area nearby, where he could carry out traffic duty and respond to calls in quieter parts of the city. He didn't complain. In fact, he welcomed the chance to reflect. On his first day at the new post, Reed arrived early. He parked his police vehicle at the usual corner, took a deep breath, and leaned against a tree, watching the people walk by. He had done this kind of work before, helping school children cross the road, assisting drivers during busy hours, and responding to small incidents in the neighborhood. It wasn't Buckingham Palace, but it was still important. He liked watching people. The way they hurried to work, helped each other with bags, or paused to smile at something small. It reminded him that his job wasn't just about rules or uniforms, it was about people. Real lives, real moments. And that moment with the Royal Guard had reminded him of something he hadn't thought about in a long time. Respect. Not just for others, but for traditions, for silence, for the spaces that mean something to people, even if they seem small. He had worked around the guards for years, but he had never truly understood what it took to stand that still, to stay that focused, while the world moved around you. Now he thought about it differently. The guard's voice, calm and quiet, still echoed in his mind. "This is not how we do things here." The more he thought about it, the more he realized the guard hadn't just been speaking to him. He had been speaking to the moment, to the values they both represented. And that made Reed think not only about what he had done, but about how he would carry himself from now on. Back at the palace, the royal guard who had spoken, whose name was not shared publicly, had returned to duty as usual. He stood tall, silent once again, his face calm, his eyes steady, but something was different. People who came to watch the changing of the guard looked at him with new eyes. They whispered, "That's him, that's the guard who spoke." Children pointed, amazed. Some even left notes near the palace gates, thanking the guard for his calm strength. The guard didn't react. He didn't smile or wave. That was not his role. But he noticed, and deep inside he felt the change too. Not in a proud or boastful way, but in a quiet, humble sense of duty fulfilled. Inside the palace grounds, some of the guard's fellow soldiers gave him respectful nods. They didn't make jokes or turn the moment into gossip. They simply understood that their brother in uniform had faced something unexpected and responded with grace. One morning, a letter arrived for the captain of the guard. It was from an older gentleman who had once served in the same role many years ago. "I saw the video," the letter said. "I was once in your shoes. What that young guard did, saying just enough, just at the right moment, that is true strength. Not in the sword, not in the shout, but in the self-control." The captain read the letter and quietly shared it with the guard who had spoken. The guard nodded. He didn't say much. But he read the letter again and placed it inside a small drawer where he kept a few personal items, a family photo, a ribbon from training school, and now, this letter. Elsewhere in the city, schools and training centers began using the video in their lessons. Teachers showed it to students during character-building sessions. "Watch how the guard reacts," they would say. "Look at how the officer steps back. What can we learn from this?" Young students, especially those interested in joining the police or military, watched closely. Many of them had never thought about calmness as a form of power, but now they began to understand. In one school, a young boy raised his hand and said he didn't need to shout, he just reminded the officer what was right, and that was enough. Back at the police station, Officer Reed was called in for a short meeting with a few senior members of the department. He entered the room with a quiet seriousness, unsure of what to expect. One of the officers, a kind-eyed woman with years of experience, began to speak. "Michael," she said, "we've reviewed everything, and we know you acted in the middle of a stressful situation. You didn't mean harm, but you've also taken responsibility, and that matters." Reed nodded. "We'd like to offer you something," she continued. "We're putting together a new training workshop about public behavior, emotional control, and interacting with ceremonial staff. We'd like you to help design it. Use your experience, help others learn from it." Reed was surprised. "You want me to help teach?" She smiled. "Who better to talk about respect than someone who's been on both sides of a moment like that?" Reed accepted. Over the next few weeks, he worked with a small team to create the workshop. He shared what it felt like to be overwhelmed in a crowd. He talked about the guards' calm words. He spoke about how easy it is to forget the meaning behind tradition until someone reminds you. And through it all, he felt himself changing. Not because he had made a mistake, but because he had listened, learned, and grown. Sometimes a single moment is all it takes. A moment that shows us who we are. A moment that teaches us who we want to be. The days that followed were quiet but meaningful. The rush of the news cycle had slowed down, yet the memory of the moment still lived in people's minds. The video had started conversations, not only online but also in real life, in schools, homes, and workplaces. It had turned into more than just a clip on a screen. It had become a lesson. Officer Michael Reed continued his duties across different parts of the city. He wasn't posted back at Buckingham Palace yet, but he didn't mind. The time away gave him space to think. Each day, he walked the streets, helped people with small problems, gave directions, and kept the peace. It was the kind of work that didn't make headlines, but it mattered. He found himself being more patient. He listened more closely when people spoke. He waited a little longer before reacting, and he chose his words more carefully. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, it just felt right. One evening, as he stood near a busy intersection helping pedestrians cross safely, a teenage boy approached him. The boy held a phone in his hand and looked a little nervous. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said. "Are you the officer from that video?" Reed gave a small smile. "Depends which video," he replied kindly. "The one with the Royal Guard," the boy said. "Where he spoke to you, that one?" Reed nodded. "Yes, that was me." The boy's eyes lit up. "I saw it in class. My teacher showed it to us. She said it's about how people should act when they're in uniform. She said both of you did the right thing." Reed's smile grew. "Did she now? That's good to hear." The boy nodded. "I thought it was cool. You didn't fight back or argue. You just said sorry." And the guard, he was so calm. It made me think about how strong silence can be. Reed looked at the boy thoughtfully. "It took me a while to understand that too, but I'm glad you saw it." The boy thanked him and walked away, leaving Reed standing quietly at the corner, feeling a little prouder than before. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, the guards continued their duty as usual. The one who had spoken that day, whose name was still not shared with the public, stood with the same discipline and stillness as before. But the people who watched him now did so with a different kind of respect. He had not become a celebrity, and he didn't want to be one. He had simply done his job, and in one rare moment, spoken words that reminded everyone of the values behind the uniform. His fellow guards treated him with quiet admiration, not because he broke the rules, but because he honored them in a different way. One morning, a visitor arrived at the palace with a small envelope. It was addressed to the guard who spoke. The palace staff carefully passed it along. Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter from a young girl in Scotland. She had drawn a picture of the guard standing beside a police officer with a heart between them. In her note, she wrote, "Dear Mr. Guard, I want to be like you when I grow up. Thank you for being kind. Love." At the same time, within the police department, the new training workshop Officer Reed was helping with had officially begun. Small groups of officers attended sessions where they watched the video and discussed what it meant to be calm under pressure. Reed stood at the front of the room during one of the sessions, not as a teacher, but as someone simply sharing his experience. "I didn't plan for that moment," he told the room. "I didn't go in wanting to be recorded or noticed, but it happened. And what I learned is that sometimes the quietest moments can teach us the loudest lessons." He looked at the other officers. "The guard didn't yell at me, he didn't make a scene. He just reminded me of something I had forgotten, that this uniform we wear, whether it's blue or red, means something. And when we respect each other, we show respect to everyone watching." The room was silent, not because they had nothing to say, but because they were truly listening. One officer raised his hand. "Do you think people expect us to be perfect?" Reed shook his head gently. "I think people expect us to be human. But they hope we'll be the kind of humans who know when to listen, when to speak, and when to step back." After the session, several officers approached him to thank him. Some even shared their own experiences, times when they had made small mistakes, or when they had been reminded of the weight their badge carried. In a quiet way, the incident at the palace had brought something new to the department. Not stricter rules or more pressure, but a deeper sense of awareness. Officers weren't just learning how to react, they were learning how to reflect. A week later, Reed received a formal message from his supervisor. It was short and simple. "You've been cleared for palace duty again if you're ready." He sat with the message for a moment, then replied, "I'm ready." The next day, he walked back onto the grounds of Buckingham Palace. The air was cool, the sky a pale blue. The palace looked just as it had before, but to Reed, it felt different now. He stood at his post, nodded to a few of the guards, and took a deep breath. As tourists began to arrive, some recognized him. A few took photos from a distance. But most simply moved on, watching the ceremony, enjoying the moment. And that was fine with him. A little while later, the changing of the guard began. The sound of drums filled the air, and the guards marched with perfect steps. Everything moved like clockwork. Then, as Reed stood near the same spot where the moment had happened days ago, the same royal guard from that day marched past him. As he moved by, he looked directly at Reed just for a second and gave the slightest nod. It was almost invisible. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but Reed saw it, and in that quiet gesture there was a message, not of blame, not of pride, but of respect. Reed nodded back just as subtly. No words were spoken, none were needed. Because some stories don't end with big speeches or dramatic scenes. Sometimes they end with understanding. And a nod between two people who remember what it means to wear a uniform and to carry its meaning with honor. Weeks had passed since the quiet moment that had caught the world's attention. The video of the Royal Guard and officer Michael Reed had traveled far and wide, and though the buzz around it had slowly settled, the lessons it carried continued to echo in people's hearts. Life in London had returned to its normal rhythm. Tourists still crowded around Buckingham Palace, eager to witness the changing of the guard. Families took photos. Children stared in awe at the soldiers in red and black, wondering how they could stand so still for so long. But behind the beauty of the tradition, something had shifted, not just for those who watched, but for those who wore the uniforms as well. For Officer Reed, everything looked the same, the gates, the crowds, the familiar footpath, but he felt different. He had grown through the experience, not just as a police officer, but as a person. The moment with the Royal Guard had made him think deeply, and he now carried a sense of responsibility that went beyond rules and routine. Each day he returned to duty at the palace, he did so with a quiet sense of purpose. He greeted tourists with more patience, gave instructions with more care, and stayed alert not only for safety, but for the respect the place deserved. His voice was steady, his posture confident, and his heart calm. One afternoon, as he stood near the gates keeping watch, a woman with a camera walked up to him. "Excuse me," she said gently, "are you the officer from the video?" Reed nodded with a polite smile. "Yes, ma'am." The woman smiled back. "I just wanted to say thank you. My son is in training to become a soldier. He saw what happened. It made him proud. It reminded him what being in uniform really means." Reed's smile softened. "That means a lot. Thank you for telling me." She nodded and stepped back into the crowd. Reed turned his eyes back to the guards, who were now moving into formation. The sound of boots on pavement filled the air, followed by the rhythmic beat of the drums. The ceremony began once again. Among the guards in the formation was the one who had spoken that day, the same guard who had reminded Reed, with just a few words, of the power of restraint and honor. They hadn't exchanged many words since, but they didn't need to. Their understanding had been built through one brief but meaningful moment. The changing of the guard continued smoothly. The crowd clapped softly at the end, a few people cheering quietly out of excitement and admiration. As the new guards took their positions and the older ones marched off, the ceremony faded into silence once again. Later that day, back at the police station, Officer Reed was called into a meeting room. Waiting there were his supervisor, two senior officers, and someone in a formal suit, a representative from the palace. Reed stood tall, unsure of what to expect. The supervisor began, "Michael, thank you for coming. This isn't a review or an inquiry. This is something different." The man from the palace stepped forward and extended a small, dark blue envelope. He handed it to Reed and said, "This is for you. It's a message from someone who appreciated how you handled a difficult situation. Please read it when you're ready." Reed took the envelope and gave a small nod. "Thank you." He opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter on elegant palace stationery. The words were short but meaningful. "To Officer Michael Reed, in moments of challenge, we often discover our true character. Your calm, respectful response in a delicate situation has been noted and appreciated. You carried your role with grace, and in doing so, reminded many of the importance of humility and professionalism. With sincere regard." He didn't know exactly who wrote it, perhaps someone high within the royal household. But the message itself was enough. He folded the letter neatly and placed it gently back in the envelope, holding it with quiet pride. The room was silent for a few moments, then his supervisor said, "We're proud of how you handled everything. The moment may have been small, but the way it was handled had a big impact." Reed nodded slowly. "I've learned a lot," he said, "more than I expected to," and he had. He had learned that sometimes the greatest strength was found in staying calm, that a simple sentence spoken at the right time could echo louder than a crowd, that both police officers and guards, despite their different duties, stood for something greater than themselves. Outside the police station, the wind blew gently through the city streets. People went about their lives, walking, talking, laughing, unaware of the quiet conversation that had just happened inside. But for those who had followed the story, the memory of that moment stayed with them. In schools, teachers continued to share the video as part of character lessons. They spoke about self-control, dignity, and how real leadership often comes without raising your voice. In one classroom, a teacher stood at the front with the video paused on the screen. "What do you notice about the guard's face?" she asked the students. "He's serious," said one boy. "He's calm," added a girl. "He didn't get angry," said another student. The teacher nodded. "Exactly, and that's what makes it powerful. He stayed true to his role. And the officer, even though he made a mistake, showed respect in return. That's how real professionals act." The lesson wasn't about perfection. It was about how people respond to pressure. How they treat each other. How they carry their roles, whether in a red coat or a blue one. Back at Buckingham Palace, the days rolled on. The guard who had spoken continued his duty like before, quiet, steady, precise. But there was now a kind of quiet recognition in the air. People didn't just see a statue in uniform anymore. They saw a person, a symbol of strength that didn't come from movement, but from discipline and heart. One morning, as Officer Reed was standing at his usual spot near the gates, a young girl walked up holding a sketch pad. She had drawn a picture of a guard and a police officer shaking hands. "I made this for you," she said shyly. Reed knelt slightly to accept it. "Did you draw this yourself?" She nodded proudly. "Yes, my mom told me the story. I think you're both heroes." Reed smiled warmly. "Thank you, that's very kind of you." He carefully folded the drawing and placed it in his pocket. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't official. But to him, it was as meaningful as the letter from the palace. That evening, as the city lights began to glow and the streets grew quiet, Officer Reed stood at the gates and looked out at the city he served. He thought about everything that had happened, the mistake, the reaction, the silence, the words. He didn't regret that the moment had happened. It had reminded him of why he wore the badge in the first place. Not for power, not for recognition, but to protect, to guide, and to carry himself in a way that made people feel safe and respected. And he knew the guard had likely felt the same. Though they had only shared a few words, they had spoken to something greater than themselves. The values behind the uniforms, the duty behind the silence, and the strength behind a calm voice. Sometimes history isn't written in loud events or big speeches. Sometimes it's written in a nod, in an apology, in a gentle reminder, in the quiet between two people who understand what it means to serve. And that, more than anything, was the true story behind the moment the world saw: one guard, one officer, and one sentence that reminded everyone of the power of dignity.